Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week is my first video of 2023. So if you're watching this in real time, Happy New Year. Let's hope you all have a great 2023. If you're watching this, say, in 6 months from now, I hope you're having a great 2023. Before we get too much into the video, maybe just mention these materials that I'll be using. So again, it's using these Derwent XL graphite and charcoal blocks. And I'm also using this drawing pad. It's just some drawing paper. It's a toned tan or brownish colored paper. This is a new paper. I haven't tried this before, so it's always a bit of an experiment with the new paper. How will the charcoal and the graphite react on the paper? Is it a shiny paper or a smooth paper or things like that? We'll see as the video goes on how it works out. I'd also like to take a moment in this video to say thank you to everyone who supports me on Patreon and has supported me over the last year. It's about a year now, give or take, since I started the Patreon page. If you're not familiar with Patreon, it's just a website where people can support artists and creatives. And like I say, I started about a year ago, and the money that comes in from that Patreon, 100% of it goes back into art materials, such as these drawing pads. I go through quite a bit of paper, so I really appreciate the support from Patreon, because that helps to keep the whole thing going, including this channel, basically. To get 2023 off to a sort of creative start, I decided to give myself a little project. Nothing too serious or anything, just something to focus on the beginning of the year, get the year started in a creative way. So I decided to do a zine. I think I've talked about zines before in this channel. A zine is just a little self-published booklet or pamphlet, and it can be on pretty much any topic that you like. The topic that I chose was the Blasket Islands. So the Blasket Islands are a small group of islands. I think there's about 4 or 5 islands in the group. They're just off the southwest coast of Ireland, off the coast of County Kerry. Just about 3 kilometers, so that's about, I don't know, 1.5 miles or so off the coast, the mainland, in the Atlantic Ocean. The biggest island in the group, well, in Irish it's called An Blasket Mór, which usually translates as Great Blasket, which is quite a grandiose name. I should say this drawing that I'm doing at the moment, this is Great Blasket Island. So this is the main island in the group. The actual island itself is maybe a little more modest than the name would suggest. It's just over 1,000 acres in terms of land area. Much of that land it's quite a hilly, almost mountainous island. It just sort of rises up out of the ocean. So an awful lot of that land isn't really usable, or you can't really live on it. It's too steep. But the whole island is about 4 miles long and about half a mile wide. But it was home to a small community for a very long time. At its peak, the community maybe had about 150 people, but for most of its history, it had 100, 120 so people. And it was quite a unique community, not just in Ireland or even in Western Europe, but I think maybe even in the Western world. It was quite unique for a number of reasons, but mainly because the island was quite isolated. Like I say, it was only maybe 1 mile, 1.5 miles off the coast of the mainland, but that's 1.5 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. And if you live anywhere near the Atlantic Ocean, whether it's North America, Europe, you'll know that there are a lot of big storms on the Atlantic, big waves. It can be quite a dangerous ocean, especially when your only form of transport is little tiny wooden rowing boats. That's how the people got to and from the mainland. And around the island, of course, there's strong currents and submerged rocks and things. So it's quite a difficult crossing. Even today with modern boats, it's still quite... the island can be isolated, cut off from the mainland for weeks on end still. And this isolation meant that the community, the people living there, developed their own unique culture. They had no amenities on the island really. There was no electricity, no running water, there were no health facilities, there was no church or anything. There was nothing really. There was just a few small cottages. The only thing they did have was a one-room schoolhouse, if you like, a little cottage, stone cottage. They did, from time to time, they were able to persuade a teacher to come over from the mainland and to teach the children on the island. But I think it was quite difficult for them to convince the teachers to come over. The teachers, they couldn't commute onto the island. They had to live on the island. And life was sometimes maybe quite tough on the island. It was a subsistence lifestyle. Basically, the islanders had to produce all of their own food. In fact, they had to produce pretty much everything that they needed for life. So it would not have been a lifestyle for everybody, I guess. Some of the islanders who lived there, grew up there, they said the summertime was like heaven on earth. They had lots to eat and there was lots of freedom and everything else. Everybody on the island knew everybody and there was never any problems. But then in the winter time, it was kind of the opposite, because then they could start to go hungry and life became really tough. Being isolated, it also meant that they stuck to the older Irish language. They didn't. English was very much a foreign language. A few of them maybe spoke a bit of English, but their native language was Irish, and it was a kind of unique dialect of the Irish language as well. Very rich form of the Irish language, lots of idiomatic use of language. Like I say, the community was just over 100 people, and that continued up until sort of 1936. There were still well over 100 people, 120 people living on the island. But then the Second World War kind of changed everything. The Irish Republic did not take part in the Second World War. They were neutral. They weren't involved in the fighting directly. But all of the turmoil and everything in Europe, it certainly had an effect on the Irish Republic. And one of the effects was, after the Second World War, a lot of people emigrated. A lot of people emigrated to the US, and some people emigrated to Britain, including a lot of people on the island. So as I say, in 1936, the census in 1936, there were 120 something people living on the island. By 1946, just 10 years later, the population had dropped by almost 2/3. So more than 60% of the population left. They emigrated. And of course, with emigration, it's very often the younger people who are leaving. So the young adults who are leaving. So they're leaving behind a population on the island which is mostly older people and children. And it wasn't viable anymore. As I say, the only way on and off the island were these little wooden rowing boats, and basically that meant you needed young men because they had the strength to control the boats through the very strong currents and avoid the rocks and everything else. So when those young men basically emigrated to the States, that was kind of the end of that community. So by 1950, 51, the population had dropped by another 50%. It was down to just over 20 people. And that really was then unviable. So the islanders themselves asked the Irish government for an evacuation of the island, which the government agreed to. And that just meant that everybody who was left on the island was taken off. Some of them settled on the mainland, and again others emigrated. most of the emigration to the US was to Massachusetts. I'm not sure why they chose there, but I guess if one or two people early on chose Massachusetts, then other islanders would want to go to the same sort of area. So like I say, I created this little zine. It's not very long, but it was an interesting little project to get the year started. If anybody's interested, and again, I'm not trying to sell anybody anything or anything like this, but the software that I use to create things like zines and newsletters is a thing called Affinity Publisher. And this is what you can see on the screen at the moment. So I thought I'd include this just in case anybody's interested in producing their own little newsletter or zine or something. Affinity Publisher, I think, is a good software to work with. It's much easier to move around images and things and include images. If you work with something like Microsoft Word, you'll know that moving images around on Microsoft Word is a huge problem. It just doesn't really work. But on Affinity Publisher, it's so easy just to move things around, and you can change colors and all of that kind of thing. These are two of the final drawings, and you can see some of the other artwork that I included in the zine. It was a bit of a challenge for me in that usually if you watch this channel on a regular basis, you'll know that the landscapes I do, they're not real landscapes as such, because I'm working from imagination and memory. But because the Blasket Highlands are real, it's a real place, I felt that I had to use reference. So working from a reference was quite a new experience for me, and therefore a bit of a challenge. But even with the references, I think I still stray off and start using a bit of imagination. It was also a challenge in that, as you could maybe see when I was showing the Affinity Publisher, I also included a few portraits and things in there of famous writers from the Blasket Islands. And again, that was a challenge because doing any sort of portrait thing, that's well outside of my comfort zone. It's not something I do very often. But anyway, I put the final zine up onto Patreon, and I'll probably have another go at one of these things. These little projects are quite good to get things started if you're thinking about what to do. Creating a poster or a zine or something, it's just something to focus your mind on maybe. So I definitely recommend these little projects. Anyway, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching, and hopefully see you in next week's video.